The door to the greenhouse slammed lightly against the frame as Michelle slid across the icy ground, landing in the entrance with a suddenness that froze everyone inside. Her robe shifted just enough to show how quickly she had moved, her breath visible in the freezing air. Morgan's face drained of color. The woman beside him stepped back, as if the cold had reached through the glass and touched her spine. Michelle didn't raise her voice. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She simply looked at her husband and said, "Well, look at God showing me things I didn't ask for." The words cut through the quiet space sharper than the winter air. Morgan's hand slipped away from the woman's waist. The woman's smile vanished. Every inch of the moment felt suspended, like the world had paused just to witness this mistake in full. But the shock in the room was nothing compared to what Michelle felt inside, because betrayal has a way of numbing you before it burns you. And so the voiceover begins, steady and reflective. Have you ever loved someone so deeply that their betrayal didn't feel real at first? Another question echoes. Have you ever opened a door and felt your entire life tilt in one breath? Images flash. Michelle's stunned expression, Morgan's guilt, the woman stepping back, the cold air drifting through the greenhouse. I followed my husband to Alaska for peace, but instead I found a truth colder than the snow. Back in the greenhouse, Michelle's eyes narrow, not in rage but in clarity. Her decision forms. Her next move prepares itself silently, then with a whisper that changes everything. The greenhouse door remained open behind Michelle, letting a gust of cold air sweep through the space. The frost floating in felt almost symbolic, like the world itself was reacting to what she had walked into. Morgan tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. The other woman stepped farther back, clutching her coat, suddenly aware that she had no place left to stand. Michelle didn't need to shout. Her silence was far louder than any raised voice. Her eyes moved once, from Morgan's face to his hands, reminding him of exactly where those hands had been just seconds before she arrived. It wasn't rage that filled her expression. It was recognition, the kind that makes a person understand something without needing explanations. Morgan finally whispered her name, Michelle, as if saying it could somehow soften the moment. But Michelle gave him nothing in return. No nod, no question, no tears. Just a steady gaze that told him the truth had already been recorded in her heart. And over that frozen moment her voice returned, Morgan reaching out but stopping himself. The other woman lowering her head. The snow outside untouched except for Michelle's footprints. Michelle's voice continues. Life has a way of exposing what you need to see, even when you never asked for it. The music shifts, soft, reflective, thoughtful. Stay with me. This story begins where most people break. The screen fades from black into a slow pan across the snowy yard outside Michelle and Morgan's home. The frost on the windows, the untouched snow, and the silent morning all echo the weight of what had just happened. Yet in that stillness, something else lingers, resolve. The camera cuts briefly to Michelle's calm face as she walks away from the greenhouse, her robe wrapped tight, her steps controlled. Each footstep presses into the snow with purpose, not panic. A soft transition brings us back inside the house, the kitchen light warm against the cold morning outside. Michelle places her hand on the counter, breathing slowly, gathering her thoughts. She isn't collapsing. She's centering herself. The world didn't know it yet, but the decision I made that day surprised everyone, even the man who hurt me. Quick cut to Morgan inside the greenhouse, still frozen in disbelief, watching the doorway she had just walked through. The music lifts, gentle, warm, inviting. Welcome to Mr. Michael Stories, where America's greatest stories and life lessons meet creativity and heart. If you're new to the family, we're grateful to have you here. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It helps us bring more unforgettable stories your way. Anchorage had a quiet that Michelle never fully trusted. It wasn't the peaceful kind she imagined before moving. It was a stillness that made every sound echo a little too clearly, and every thought linger longer than it should. When she first arrived 5 years earlier, she remembered stepping off the plane and whispering, "This cold is personal." What shocked her wasn't the temperature. It was how the cold seemed to crawl straight into a person's choices, revealing things you didn't plan on facing. Michelle came from Atlanta. Warm weather, warm people, warm food, and a sense of rhythm in everyday life. Her childhood was filled with Sunday dinners, so loud the neighbors could hear the laughter through their walls. That energy traveled with her everywhere she went. Even in Anchorage, where the local grocery store sometimes had 3 kinds of snowmelt but no seasoning salt, Michelle carried her Atlanta energy with pride. When she met Morgan years before, she had no idea she would someday be living in a place where her lip balm froze in her pocket. What she did know was that Morgan had a way of speaking that made you lean in. He wasn't loud. He wasn't flashy. He didn't try to impress anybody. Yet somehow he impressed everyone without trying. He was calm in conversations, patient in conflict, and thoughtful in moments where other men rushed to defend themselves. He had built his renewable energy empire long before she came into the picture. It wasn't the money that caught her attention. It was his sincerity. Morgan never treated his wealth like a trophy. He treated it like a tool, something to fix the world with. When he asked her to move to Alaska with him, he said it with a softness that still echoed in her ears sometimes. It'll give us space to grow. A place where life moves slower. Michelle had laughed and said, "Slower? Baby, this cold gon' freeze my ambitions." But deep down, she trusted him. She believed him. She believed in the house they would create together, the marriage they would build, the promises they exchanged under a warm Georgia sky. At first, Alaska did offer something peaceful. Their home sat far enough from the city to feel private, but close enough that Michelle didn't feel trapped. She loved the sight of mountains layered in the distance like something drawn by a careful hand. She loved the quiet mornings when you could hear the snow settling outside. What she didn't love was how few black folks she met on a regular day. Michelle had once joked to Morgan, "If I see another aisle in the store with only unseasoned choices, I'm calling the embassy." Morgan had laughed in that composed way of his, shoulders relaxed, hands in pockets, eyes narrowing with amused affection. They were opposite in all the right places. Michelle was expressive, Morgan was measured. Michelle teased, Morgan absorbed. Michelle lit up a room, Morgan grounded it. That balance was the foundation of their marriage. They didn't always agree, but they always connected. Even their differences felt intentional, like 2 puzzle pieces carved from different materials but still shaped to fit. Life in Anchorage began to settle into a pattern. Morgan woke early most days, usually before sunrise. He started his mornings with the same routine like a well-rehearsed ritual. Warm coffee in a mug he refused to replace. A short walk across the yard to clear his thoughts, and then hours spent reviewing operations for his company. Michelle teased him about being predictable. "One day I'm going to move that mug just to see what happens to your spirit," she'd say. He would smile and answer, "Chaos. Complete chaos." Michelle herself developed habits to stay grounded. She cooked more. She decorated the house with pieces that reminded her of home. Photo frames with gold edges, soft blankets, bright colors that pushed back against the winter outside. She embraced the challenge of bringing warmth to a place that carried so much cold. Their marriage wasn't perfect, but it was real. They had days where they felt deeply connected and others where they misunderstood each other completely. Yet nothing ever felt broken, at least not until the morning she woke up and noticed something was off. A small change in Morgan's routine that didn't match the man she knew so well. But that part of the story was waiting just ahead. The morning began with a quiet that didn't feel like the usual Alaskan calm. It was the kind of quiet that made Michelle's eyelids flutter open before her mind even caught up. She lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling, noticing the slight chill in the room and the emptiness on the other side of the bed. It wasn't unusual for Morgan to rise early, he often did, but something about the air felt different. Michelle's bonnet had shifted halfway off her head during the night, and one sleeve of her pajamas was twisted so far around her arm that she had to sit up and fix herself before moving. She reached over to Morgan's side, half expecting to feel leftover warmth. There was none. It felt cold, almost untouched. She murmured, rubbing her eyes. This morning got personality already." She swung her legs over the side of the bed and shuffled toward the hallway, her feet brushing against the wooden floor that usually creaked under her steps. Today, even the creaks felt hesitant, like they didn't want to announce anything before Michelle figured out what she was sensing. The house was large, too large in Michelle's opinion, but she had grown used to its quiet corners and long hallways. Her footsteps echoed softly as she made her way toward the kitchen. Morning light filtered through the tall windows, giving the space a pale glow, but something immediately caught her eye. Morgan's mug, his beloved, scratched, never-to-be-replaced mug, was missing. Michelle stopped in her tracks. Now this was strange. Morgan was a man of routine, the kind of man who could run businesses across the country but somehow couldn't start his day without that mug. He called it reliable. Michelle called it that raggedy cup. But it was always there, same spot, same angle, same unnecessary dedication. Not today. Michelle's eyes narrowed. So now we switching up traditions? Interesting. She looked around the counter, checking the dish rack, even glancing in the sink. Nothing. Her intuition, the one that sharpened from years of reading people, reading rooms, and reading nonsense, started buzzing like a low alarm in her chest. She turned toward the patio doors leading to the backyard and immediately noticed something else that didn't belong. Footprints. Fresh ones. Michelle pressed her hand against the glass as she looked closer. The prints traveled from the back porch to the far end of the yard, heading straight toward the greenhouse. She blinked twice. Now hold on. Morgan didn't garden. He didn't attempt gardening. He didn't even pretend gardening was a possibility. She had once asked him to help replant a flower, and he held the shovel like it was a foreign object with instructions written in another language. Yet here were footprints, clear, defined, leading directly to the place he avoided like the cold avoided Atlanta. Michelle pulled her robe tighter around her waist.
Now why would this man be out there in this weather before the sun even finished waking up?
Something was off. Not dramatic, not explosive, just wrong. Michelle was the type to joke through irritation. Lord, if this snow makes me fall, I'm suing winter and everyone responsible. She slipped into her house boots and stepped outside. The cold slapped her instantly, but she pushed forward, following the footprints with slow, careful steps. Each crunch of snow under her feet reminded her that she wasn't imagining things. Morgan had definitely walked this path today, and not lightly. The footprints were deep, like he wasn't just passing through. He had purpose. Michelle tilted her head and whispered, "Purposeful footsteps before coffee. Something ain't right." Her breath formed small clouds around her face as she moved across the yard. The world was quiet. Too quiet. Even the usual morning birds seemed to be minding their business. The closer she got to the greenhouse, the louder her intuition got. By the time she reached the door, her pulse had settled into that steady, focused rhythm she knew well, the one that came right before discovering something she didn't prepare for. She placed her hand on the doorknob, paused. Her voice softened, half amused and half preparing herself. If I open this door and see foolishness, I'm turning right back around. I got boundaries now. A thin gust of cold wind swept around her ankles as she pushed the door open. Soft, low, close, her entire body stilled. Michelle didn't need a script, didn't need explanations, didn't need to walk further into the greenhouse. The tone of the voices was enough to confirm her intuition had not only been correct, it had been polite compared to the truth waiting inside. Deep, controlled. Her eyes sharpened. The next few seconds would alter everything she thought she woke up to. The moment Michelle heard those voices, her entire heartbeat changed. They weren't businesslike, rushed, or accidental. They were warm, too warm. The kind of soft tone that had no place in a greenhouse at sunrise, especially from Morgan, who barely liked being in this structure long enough to check the thermostat. She narrowed her eyes and took one slow step forward, the sound of her boot compacting the snow louder than the whispers inside. Her breath gathered in the cold air, swirling around her face like a warning sign she chose not to ignore. Michelle pushed the door open another inch, and the hinge made a tiny sound. Not loud, but loud enough to stop the murmuring just long enough for her curiosity to sharpen. She braced her hand on the frame, leaned in slightly, and listened again. Morgan's voice, gentle, lower than usual, colored with an affection she hadn't heard directed at her in months. Michelle's jaw tightened. Her intuition didn't hum this time. It howled. She placed her other hand on the door, pushed it fully open, and stepped onto a slick patch of ice she didn't see. Her foot slipped forward. Then the other followed. For a split second, time stretched out, and she could almost hear her own thoughts saying, her slide wasn't graceful, it wasn't cute. It was dramatic, unplanned, and surprisingly efficient. She glided straight across the entrance and landed perfectly centered in the doorway, robe fluttering, hair slightly shifting from the motion, expression more stunned than embarrassed. Morgan's eyes widened instantly. The woman beside him flinched, stepping backward like she was hoping the plants would hide her. Michelle didn't blink, didn't gasp, didn't clutch her robe tighter. She steadied herself, straightened her posture, and allowed the silence to stretch just long enough to make both of them uncomfortable. Morgan's mouth opened, closed, and opened again. His face drained of its morning calm as panic slid across his features. He took half a step forward as if to explain himself, but Michelle lifted her palm, stopping him before he could form a single excuse. Her voice was calm, too calm. "Don't move," she said. "I don't want your nonsense mixing with this greenhouse air." The woman behind him swallowed hard, lowering her gaze. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. The guilt in her posture was loud enough. She cut him off immediately. "Oh? So y'all in here practicing emergency breathing techniques? At this hour? In this cold? With your hands on her waist?" Morgan's face twitched, like even he knew there was no version of events that would make sense right now. He lifted both hands slowly, palms out, almost like he was surrendering. "I can explain?" Michelle raised an eyebrow. "I'm sure you can. People always find grammar when they're guilty." Her robe shifted slightly as she adjusted it, but her expression didn't soften. She watched Morgan the same way someone watches a pot boil, unimpressed, unhurried, and fully aware of the heat rising. The woman tried to speak, but Michelle turned her attention on her so fast it made her freeze. "No, ma'am," Michelle said quietly. "I don't want your explanation package. Return it to sender." Morgan flinched. Michelle glanced at his hands again. "You have the nerve to touch another woman before touching a cup of coffee? Bold." Morgan tried stepping forward again, desperation in his eyes. "Please, just listen." She stepped back instantly. "Nope, stay right there. I don't want your excuses melting the snow." That line made even the plants seem to stand straighter. Michelle turned around, her boots crunching against the icy floor. She didn't storm out, didn't slam anything, didn't shout. She moved with calm power, the kind that comes from a woman who realized her strength didn't require chaos. As she reached the doorway, she paused just long enough for Morgan to think she might say something else. She didn't. She walked back into the cold without looking over her shoulder. Morgan stood frozen. The other woman stood frozen. The greenhouse itself felt frozen in the aftermath. Michelle's footsteps faded into the yard, her silhouette disappearing into the pale morning light. She didn't crumble. She didn't stagger. She didn't break. Every step she took carried a message. By the time she reached the house, her breath had steadied. Her spirit had steadied. Her decision-making had awakened. This betrayal didn't stop her. It activated her. When Michelle stepped back into the house after leaving the greenhouse, the warmth inside felt strange, almost unfamiliar. She closed the door gently behind her, stood still for a long second, and let the quiet settle into her bones. The same house that held laughter, teasing, and early morning banter now held something heavier. But even in that weight, Michelle felt something she didn't expect. Control, her mother used to say, baby. When life throws you chaos, don't throw yourself with it. Stand still long enough for the truth to show itself. Michelle had heard that line since she was a teenager, usually after making impulsive decisions or overreacting to something small. Back then, she used to roll her eyes and say, "Mama, standing still is not my ministry." But now, with the cold truth still fresh in her chest, her mother's words settled into her spirit like they'd been waiting for this moment. She walked to the kitchen counter and placed both hands on the smooth surface. Her fingers curled slightly as if gripping something invisible. Strength, maybe, or clarity. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't gasping. She wasn't pacing. Instead, she inhaled slowly, letting the breath fill her chest before releasing it in a measured stream. Silence. That was her first weapon. She knew that if she reacted wildly, the situation would become about her emotions instead of Morgan's actions. Her mother drilled that lesson deep. Silence makes people confront themselves. Noise gives them something else to point at. Michelle wasn't about to give Morgan a distraction. She walked around the kitchen slowly, touching the back of a chair, adjusting a napkin on the counter, steadying her breathing with each small gesture. Inside, there was a storm, 1,000 thoughts striking all at once. Images replayed, Morgan leaning close, the other woman smiling up at him, the tone of his voice. A flash of embarrassment came, then confusion, then something sharper, but none of that touched her face. Her exterior remained calm, intentional, protected. Another of her mother's sayings surfaced, "Your emotions are yours, not public property. Guard them." Michelle understood that better now than she ever had. Betrayal wasn't just about the act. It was about what you allowed it to do to you. She wasn't going to let it reduce her. She wasn't going to let it twist her voice or shake her foundation. She walked to the living room and sat on the sofa, hands folded in her lap, staring at the wall as if it held answers. The storm inside didn't disappear. It churned, raging quietly behind her ribs, but the calm on her face anchored her. She wasn't suppressing her feelings. She was containing them, choosing where and when to release them. Her thoughts scattered and rebuilt themselves repeatedly. How long has this been happening? Why would he step this low? Was I not enough? Did he forget who I am? What changed? But for every painful question, her strength answered, "This moment won't define me. I won't lose myself. He doesn't dictate my worth. I decide the next step." Michelle crossed one leg over the other and leaned back into the sofa with slow precision. She didn't even realize how composed she appeared, how regal, how centered. But that was the thing about quiet strength. It isn't something you perform. It's something that rises in you naturally when chaos tries to tip you over. She ran a hand over her forehead, smoothing a few loose strands of hair. Her voice, when she finally spoke into the empty room, was steady. "I'm not going to break." Saying it aloud grounded her. Another breath. Another wave of silence. Another reminder of who she was before the betrayal tried to rewrite her identity. Michelle had always known how to stand firm. Life had demanded that from her early on. But today, standing firm felt different. Not defensive, not prideful, purposeful. She stood from the sofa slowly, her posture straight, her chin lifted just a little. The storm inside her chest quieted, not gone, but no longer wild. She was holding it, shaping it, preparing it. Morgan would come in eventually. He would talk. He would reach for explanations. He would stumble through excuses. But Michelle wasn't going to meet his panic with panic. She would meet it with clarity. Silence had already wrapped itself around her like armor, and her mother's wisdom guided her every breath. By the time Morgan stepped foot back into the house, Michelle would be ready, not to fall apart, but to stand taller than she ever had. This wasn't weakness. This was preparation. While Michelle sat in the living room gathering strength through silence, Morgan remained in the greenhouse far longer than he intended. The cold settled around him, but he barely felt it. His mind was locked on one image, the look on Michelle's face when she slid into the doorway. Not angry, not explosive, just aware. That look had sliced through him sharper than any raised voice could have. He replayed the moment again and again, her entrance, her stare, her words, the quiet power she carried even while wounded. Morgan had seen her upset before. He had seen frustration, disappointment, even the occasional argument that ended with both of them apologizing before bedtime. But he had never seen her this still, this controlled, this precise. And that terrified him more than the truth she walked in on. He tried to gather his thoughts, but everything tangled into knots: shame, regret, disbelief, panic. He whispered Michelle's name under his breath, as if saying it could pull her back into a version of their life that no longer existed. Finally, he forced himself to leave the greenhouse. Each step back toward the house felt heavier than the snow beneath him. By the time he opened the back door, he felt like he was entering a courtroom where the judge already had the evidence ready. He found Michelle seated in the living room, legs crossed, posture straight, expression unreadable. She didn't flinch when he walked in. She didn't turn her head quickly. She acknowledged him only with a brief glance that carried enough weight to make him stop in his tracks. Morgan swallowed hard. "Michelle!" She lifted one eyebrow. Not high, just enough to let him know she heard him. She saw him, and she wasn't impressed. He cleared his throat, trying to find a starting point. I need to explain what happened." Michelle leaned back slightly and asked, "Oh, you got a thesis prepared already?" Her tone wasn't loud. It wasn't sarcastic. It was sharp in the most controlled way, slicing cleanly through the tension. Morgan winced. "I know how this looks." Michelle's eyes sharpened. "Looks?" "Morgan, it didn't look like anything. It was exactly what it was." He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His hands trembled slightly, so he clasped them together to hide it. Michelle motioned lightly toward the seat across from her. "Sit. If you're about to serve me a story, at least sit down to deliver it." He obeyed immediately, sinking into the chair. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the faint hum of the heating system. Morgan took a slow breath. "Michelle, I hurt you, and I know that. I know nothing I say will erase what you saw, but I want to be honest." His voice cracked a little. "I've been overwhelmed. I've been drifting. There's been this distance I didn't know how to talk about." Michelle didn't blink. "So your solution was warming up the greenhouse with somebody else's smile?" He closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the hit. "No. Yes. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. I wasn't thinking clearly." Michelle uncrossed her legs and leaned forward just slightly. "Morgan, nobody accidentally ends up holding someone that way. You didn't trip and fall into affection." Her words hit him harder than her silence. He tried again. "It wasn't love. It wasn't anything deep. I just felt lost and let someone get close when I shouldn't have." Michelle nodded slowly. "And you didn't think to tell your wife you were lost?" "I didn't know how," he whispered. "And somehow she did?" Michelle asked, pointing to the greenhouse. Morgan's shoulders sagged. "I'm sorry." Michelle tilted her head, studying him with a level of calm that made him feel even smaller. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She didn't plead for answers. Her peace forced him to confront the truth without defense. Finally, she asked the question that shifted the entire tone of the room. "Do you still want this marriage?" Morgan's head snapped up. His breath hitched. He wasn't expecting that, at least not so directly, not so early, not from a woman sitting with that much stillness in her eyes. "Yes," he said instantly. "Absolutely. Completely. I love you, Michelle. I don't want to lose you." Michelle held his gaze without softening. "Wanting me and treating me right aren't the same thing." He nodded quickly. I know that now." "Do you?" she asked quietly. "Because your actions said the opposite this morning." Morgan leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped tightly. "I will do anything to fix this. Anything!" Michelle inhaled through her nose, exhaled slowly, and allowed a small, calculated smile to form. A smile that wasn't gentle, wasn't forgiving, and wasn't angry. It was strategic. It was the smile of a woman who already knew something he didn't. "We'll get to that. But first, you need to understand this isn't the moment you think it is." Morgan frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Michelle stood up with grace, smoothing her robe. Her calm filled the room like a command. "You broke something. But I'm not the one who's about to fall apart." With that, she walked toward the kitchen, leaving Morgan staring after her, shaken, uncertain, and finally beginning to understand the weight of what he had done. This wasn't the end of their marriage. But it was the end of the way things used to be. Michelle didn't need to rush when she walked toward the kitchen. Her footsteps were steady, silent, and controlled, each one reminding her of who she was long before this moment tried to define her. She reached the counter, placed both hands flat against the cool surface, and allowed herself one private breath before turning back to face Morgan. He hadn't moved from the chair. His shoulders were tight, his posture slumped slightly, and his eyes followed her as though he feared one blink would erase her completely. He looked like a man waiting for a verdict he already knew he deserved. Michelle studied him for a moment. Not his guilt, not his panic. She focused on his posture, defeated, desperate, almost childlike in its uncertainty. A version of Morgan she had never seen before. It didn't soften her, but it clarified things. She walked back toward him with slow, measured steps. He straightened instinctively when she approached, as if bracing himself. Michelle stopped a few feet away, her expression unreadable. "Look at me," she said quietly. Morgan obeyed immediately. She held his gaze without blinking, letting silence linger just long enough to tighten the air between them. "You think I'm deciding whether I'm staying or going," she began. "But that's not what this moment is about." Morgan's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Michelle tilted her head slightly, studying him the same way a teacher studies a student who forgot the lesson. Then came the smile, the one she had given earlier, the one so precise and deliberate. It felt like a key unlocking a door he didn't know existed. It wasn't forgiving. It was the smile of a woman who had reached clarity. "I'm not leaving," she said calmly. Morgan released a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Relief washed over his face so quickly it almost softened the room. But Michelle wasn't finished. She lifted one finger. "Don't get comfortable." His relief froze instantly. Michelle continued. "I'm not leaving, but I'm not staying the way I was. I'm elevating." Morgan blinked. "Elevating?" "Yes," she replied. "You broke trust. But I'm not going to break myself in response. I'm going to rise. I'm going to rebuild. I'm going to become stronger, clearer, more grounded than I've ever been. And if this marriage is going to survive, you're going to have to rise with me." The words struck him hard, harder than her confrontation in the greenhouse, harder than the sight of her sliding into the doorway, harder than her silence. This wasn't a threat. It was a direction, a warning, a new standard. Morgan swallowed. I want to rise with you. I do. I'll do whatever it takes." Michelle stepped closer, just enough to make sure he understood the weight of what she was saying. "This isn't about whatever it takes. This is about who you choose to become," she said. "You can't fix this with gestures or promises. You have to change, permanently, consistently, not because you're scared of losing me, but because you finally see the cracks in yourself." Morgan's eyes burned slightly, but he blinked the emotion away. "I hear you. I'm trying to understand what that means for us." Michelle nodded once. "Good. Because what comes next won't be easy for either of us. I'm elevating. I'm rediscovering myself, my strength, my identity, my voice. I'm rising out of the version of me that tolerated too much silence, too much dismissal, too much trust without verification." He stood slowly, unsure if he was allowed to step closer. "Michelle, will you let me be part of that journey?" She held up her hand again, firm, commanding, stopping him in place. "I'm not answering that right now. That isn't today's question. Today's truth is simple. I'm choosing growth. You must decide if you can meet me there." Morgan's face shifted, no longer just guilt, but fear. The real kind. Not fear of losing his marriage out of logistics or reputation, but losing the woman who had anchored his life for years. Michelle turned slightly, allowing her side profile to face him. "You know what shook me the most this morning? Not seeing you with her? It was realizing how much of myself I had set aside while trying to make us work." Morgan lowered his gaze. "And now," she continued, "I'm done setting myself aside." Silence swept through the room, but it wasn't the earlier heavy silence. This one was sharper, clearer. It marked a shift neither could undo. Morgan stepped back into the chair as if his knees had given out. He stared at the floor for a long moment, his breath coming unsteady. He finally understood that the problem wasn't just the betrayal. It was everything that had been ignored before it. Michelle walked toward the stairs, her robe brushing softly against her legs. At the base of the staircase, she paused and glanced over her shoulder. Next time we talk, come prepared to show effort, not excuses. Then she ascended the steps slowly, each movement confident, firm, and undeniably self-assured. Morgan remained seated, shaken to his core, not because she rejected him, but because she didn't. She expected him to rise, and he didn't yet know if he could. But the tone had shifted. The marriage had shifted. The balance had shifted. By the end of that day, one truth became undeniable. Michelle wasn't the one who needed to fear change. Morgan was. The morning after her confrontation with Morgan didn't begin with heaviness. It began with clarity. Michelle woke before the sun, not because her sleep was disturbed, but because something inside her felt awakened. The woman who went to bed last night wasn't the same woman who opened her eyes this morning. There was a shift. Quiet, intentional, solid. She slid out of bed and wrapped her robe around herself, moving with a slow confidence that had been dormant for too long. She paused at the window, looking out at the snow-covered yard. The cold didn't intimidate her. Not today. Today she felt warm from the inside out. This wasn't a day to rebuild her marriage. This was a day to rebuild Michelle. She walked to the bathroom and turned on the warm water, letting steam fill the mirror. As she washed her face, she whispered a simple affirmation to herself. Not dramatic, not rehearsed, just truth. You're still here, and you're still you. Her reflection looked back with more strength than she expected. She didn't see betrayal. She didn't see insecurity. She saw a woman who survived yesterday with her dignity intact. A woman who didn't crumble. A woman who chose clarity over chaos. After getting dressed, she stepped into the kitchen. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a faint glow through the large windows. Michelle opened the cabinets, pulled out her favorite tea blend, one she'd been ignoring for months out of habit, and let the aroma fill the room. She prepared it slowly, giving herself permission to enjoy the small ritual. As she sipped from the cup, she felt something uncoil inside her, a soft grounding. A reminder of the things she loved before life got complicated. She found herself humming a tune from her childhood, one she heard her mother sing during long afternoons when the house smelled like cornbread and the world felt steady. Humming turned into a light sway. The sway turned into a soft, rhythmic step. Soon the kitchen felt less like a place where she confronted pain, and more like a place where she reclaimed joy. Michelle laughed softly to herself. Look at me, dancing on a Wednesday morning like the rent is paid by happiness. Humor, the piece of her identity that had always been her anchor, returned without forcing itself. She wasn't pretending to be okay. She wasn't trying to erase anything. She was honoring the part of herself that made life feel vibrant. After finishing her tea, she wrote in her journal, a habit she had neglected for too long. She wrote about how she felt, what she wanted, what she refused to tolerate anymore, and what she was ready to build within herself. Her handwriting shifted between bold and delicate, mirroring her emotions as they rearranged themselves into something she could understand. She didn't write about Morgan, not out of avoidance, but out of choice. This chapter was hers. Next, she opened the pantry and pulled out ingredients for breakfast. She hadn't cooked a full Southern breakfast in a while, but today felt like a good day to invite her roots back into her life. She cracked eggs, whisked them with a rhythm that matched her humming, seasoned everything with the confidence of someone raised in a kitchen full of stories. She plated her food beautifully, sat at the table, and ate slowly. No rushing, no worrying, just being present. This was her soulful revival. Every bite reminded her of Atlanta, her mother, her laughter, her memories of warm evenings filled with conversation and comfort. She realized she had let Alaska change her inward warmth without noticing. But today, that warmth returned like it never left. By mid-morning, Michelle stood in the living room with her hands on her hips. She scanned the space, noticing how much of it felt like Morgan's structure, and not her presence. She began opening curtains, adjusting pillows, rearranging small things, not out of distraction, but because reclaiming her space felt like reclaiming herself. Every adjustment whispered the same message. I am not shrinking in this house. Her posture straightened. Her voice, when she spoke aloud again, carried renewed certainty. I'm finding me again. Not for him. For me? She felt her strength reawakening, not the kind that roars, but the kind that stands tall and steady, impossible to push over. Michelle didn't rebuild with anger. She rebuilt with intention. She rebuilt with culture. She rebuilt with humor. She rebuilt with self-respect. The betrayal did not define her. Her response did. And as the sun climbed higher over Anchorage, her spirit rose with it. While Michelle moved through the house with renewed purpose, Morgan remained in his office, sitting motionless at his desk. The morning light filtered through the window behind him, but it didn't warm him. Nothing felt warm. His thoughts were frozen in the moment Michelle looked him directly in the eyes and asked if he still wanted their marriage. Her calm voice echoed in him louder than any argument could have. He leaned back in his chair, covering his face with both hands. Shame washed over him. Not the shallow kind that lasts a moment, but the deep kind that settles into the truth a person has been avoiding. He wasn't just ashamed of the betrayal. He was ashamed of the slow erosion inside himself that led to it. The distance he created without fully understanding why. For the first time in a long while, Morgan sat in complete stillness. No laptop open, no phone buzzing, no business reports scattered across his desk. Just silence, forcing him to confront the parts of himself he ignored for years.
What happened to me?
He whispered. The question wasn't rhetorical. He genuinely wanted to know. He replayed earlier months, how work slowly consumed him, how exhaustion made him emotionally unavailable, how he stopped expressing affection, how he let pressure drown simple moments with Michelle. None of it justified the betrayal. Nothing ever could. But he finally saw the long path of his detachment, step by step, choice by choice. And he realized something painful. Michelle didn't lose him in one moment at the greenhouse. She lost pieces of him long before that. Pieces he never noticed were slipping. He rubbed his forehead and stood, pacing the office. His movements were uneven, revealing how unsettled he felt. The walls around him, usually filled with charts, maps, and development plans, suddenly looked like barriers instead of achievements. He walked to the window and stared outside. Michelle was in the living room, rearranging things. Small gestures, subtle changes. He watched her quietly, noticing a glow in her that he hadn't seen in a long time. A glow he hadn't contributed to, a glow he almost dimmed with his choices. His chest tightened. He turned away from the window and circled back to his desk. He stared at the stack of documents waiting for him. Plans for a new project, expansion updates, budgeting papers, things he normally gave every ounce of focus to. But today, he couldn't concentrate on any of it. He reached for his phone, scrolled through his work messages, and saw dozens waiting, some urgent, some routine, all demanding the version of him who had disappeared emotionally from his home. He placed the phone face down. He walked back to the window. Then he did something he hadn't done in years. He closed his laptop entirely. It clicked shut with a finality that startled him. Morgan exhaled slowly. Work can wait. She can't. For a man who built an empire from nothing, breaking patterns wasn't comfortable. Work had become his shield, his identity, his safe place. But the truth stood before him in a way he could no longer deny. He had built a kingdom outside, and neglected the one inside his home. He sat down again, but not to escape. This time he sat with purpose. He reached for a notepad, something he hadn't used since his earlier years in business, and began writing. Not projections, not deadlines. He wrote truths. I've been absent. I stopped communicating. I let stress shape me. I forgot how to show love intentionally. I need to become a better man. I need to listen. I can't lose her. The words scratched across the paper, raw and unshielded. He didn't try to make them neat. He didn't rewrite anything. He let them spill, messy and honest. Emotion fluttered in his chest, uncomfortable, unsteady, but real. This wasn't guilt alone. This was discovery, awareness, the beginning of a shift. He stood again and walked through the hallway. He passed the living room where Michelle was adjusting the curtains. She didn't notice him immediately. She was humming softly, moving with a grace he hadn't appreciated enough. He stopped several feet behind her, watching the gentle way she handled the fabric, the quiet confidence in her posture, the warmth returning to her spirit. For the first time, Morgan realized something powerful. She was rising, and he wasn't rising with her, not yet. It struck him harder than her confrontation in the living room. If he wanted to rebuild anything, trust, respect, connection, he couldn't rely on apologies. He had to change the parts of himself that drifted away. He had to create space for vulnerability, for presence, for emotional maturity. He needed to grow. So he made a decision that felt strange but necessary. He took out his phone again, this time with intention, and typed out a short message to his assistant. Cancel today's meetings. All of them. He hit send before he could second-guess himself. The man who never missed a meeting, never paused a project, never allowed himself to slow down, finally slowed down. Morgan looked at Michelle again, quietly observing her glow returning. "Please let me become a man worthy of standing beside you," he whispered, unheard by her but heard by himself. This was the beginning of his transformation, subtle, humble, and long overdue. And for the first time he wasn't running from change. He was stepping directly into it. The shift in the house didn't happen with grand gestures or dramatic conversations. It happened in moments so small they could have been missed, if not for the quiet intensity that now lived between Michelle and Morgan. Michelle carried herself differently. Not louder, not colder, just grounded, certain, and quietly radiant. Her steps had purpose. Her posture held confidence. The unsettled tension that once hovered around her was gone, replaced with the glow of a woman rediscovering her inner world and choosing to honor it. Morgan noticed everything. He watched from doorways, from across the kitchen, from quiet corners of the living room, never intruding, never assuming he had earned space beside her again. He observed her in the way a person observes sunrise, with awe, regret, and hope all at once. That morning, Michelle moved through the living room with a brightness in her energy that felt new but familiar, like the version of her he fell in love with years ago, but wiser, sharper, more intentional. She adjusted pillows on the sofa, humming softly, letting her rhythm drift through the room without hesitation. She paused to open the window slightly, allowing fresh air to breeze through the space, lifting the curtains and bringing in a crisp scent from outside. Morgan watched her, leaning against the hallway wall. There was something about her presence that quieted his mind. Something warm but firm, gentle but unyielding. She was holding herself differently. Not for him, but for herself. He stepped forward a bit, though he didn't enter the room completely. "Do you need help with anything?" he asked, voice low, careful. Michelle didn't turn fully. She glanced over her shoulder with a soft half-smile, not warm enough to signal full comfort, but not cold either. It was a neutral acknowledgement that didn't give him more than he had earned. "I'm handling it," she replied simply, adjusting another pillow. Her tone wasn't dismissive. It was independent. That alone made Morgan's chest tighten. He wasn't used to seeing her operate so fully in her own energy without checking his direction, his mood, or his involvement. She wasn't asking for his input or waiting for his reaction. She was simply existing in her own space, on her own terms. And it humbled him deeply. Michelle moved to the bookshelf next, dusting lightly, humming the same tune she'd carried from the kitchen earlier. The sound traveled softly through the room, creating a peace that felt strangely hopeful. Morgan approached slowly but kept a respectful distance. "That song, I haven't heard you hum it in a long time." Michelle paused for a second, then shrugged lightly. "I haven't felt like humming in a long time." Her honesty wasn't meant to wound him, but it did. It sliced deeper because she didn't deliver it with anger. She delivered it with truth. Morgan lowered his gaze. "I know," Michelle continued, dusting, her movements unbothered. There was no tension in her shoulders, no trembling in her hands. She was steady in a way she hadn't been for months. Her glow wasn't loud. It was the kind of glow that came from emotional housekeeping, from sorting through pain and choosing healing over misery. When she finished, she stepped back to examine the shelf. Morgan took another small step closer, but stopped again, waiting for her to acknowledge him rather than assuming she wanted him nearby. She noticed. For a brief moment, Michelle allowed herself to study him, not with softness, but with clarity. He looked different today. Not physically, but in the way he held himself. He wasn't towering with certainty. He wasn't wrapped in the invisible armor of accomplishment. He looked like a man trying, not perfectly, not confidently, but sincerely trying. She nodded toward the couch. "You can help by moving that blanket. It's crooked." Morgan immediately went to adjust it. He straightened it carefully, making sure the edges lined up perfectly. When he finished, he looked at her for approval, almost instinctively. Michelle glanced at it, nodded once. Good. It was one word, but the weight of it stretched across the room. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but participation. Morgan sat on the edge of the sofa, unsure if staying seated was acceptable or intrusive. Michelle sat across from him in an armchair, crossing one leg over the other, relaxed but observant. For the first time since the betrayal, the silence between them didn't feel suffocating. It felt like the house had taken a breath, slow, steady, and open to possibility. Michelle leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on her knees. "Things are different now," she said calmly. Morgan nodded. "I know. I'm still healing," she continued, "and I need space to do that." "You have it," he said quickly, afraid of interrupting her. She gave a soft nod. "I see you're trying." It was the first positive acknowledgement she had given him since everything fell apart. He lifted his eyes slowly. "I am." There was a moment, brief, delicate, where their eyes met and held. Not with romance, not with certainty, but with a quiet understanding. Something had shifted. Not enough to repair everything, but enough to let hope breathe. Michelle stood, smoothing her clothes. "All right. I'm going to finish in the kitchen." Morgan stood too, instinctively. "Do you want help?" She paused, considering him for a moment. Then she gave a small nod. "You can dry the dishes." Morgan nearly exhaled with relief. Not because she needed his help, but because she allowed him to share space again. The tension that once weighed the house down began to lift, replaced by something gentler, the beginnings of rebuilding. Not as a couple, but as two people learning how to coexist again, while healing at their own pace. Hope didn't enter the house loudly. It entered through cooperation, through respect, through quiet closeness after heartbreak, and neither of them said it aloud, but they both felt it. The shift had begun. The evening light settled gently over the living room, softening the shadows and filling the house with a calm that Michelle hadn't felt in a long while. She stood near the window, her arms folded loosely, watching the slow movement of snow drifting across the yard. Everything outside looked quiet, untouched, nothing like the storm she had walked through just days earlier. Morgan approached slowly, stopping near the entrance of the room as if waiting to be invited in. He didn't speak. He didn't move further. He simply watched her, unsure how to cross the space between them without breaking whatever delicate peace had formed. Michelle sensed him but didn't turn immediately. She wanted a breath, one last grounding moment before speaking words that would alter both of their futures. Finally, she shifted her gaze toward him, her expression steady, thoughtful, unwavering. "We need to talk," she said softly. Morgan nodded, stepping forward carefully. He sat on the edge of the sofa, hands resting on his knees, tension visible in the way his fingers curled slightly. Michelle walked toward him, maintaining her composure. She sat across from him, crossing one leg slowly, placing her hands in her lap. There was no anger left in her posture, no raw frustration, just clarity. "I've made a decision," she said. Morgan's breath caught. "Okay. I'm giving this marriage another chance." His shoulders dropped with visible relief, but before he could speak, Michelle lifted her hand. "Wait." He froze. "You need to hear the whole sentence before your hope runs ahead of reason." The firmness in her tone didn't cut him. It humbled him. Michelle leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. I'm giving the marriage a chance. The marriage, not you. Not automatically. You're going to have to earn your place inside what we rebuild. Morgan swallowed, nodding slowly. I understand. No, she said calmly. Not yet. But you will. His chest tightened. She wasn't being harsh, she was being honest, Michelle continued. What we had before? It's gone. And honestly, it needed to go, because whatever we were holding on to wasn't working. I was shrinking myself. You were drifting. We were surviving instead of growing. Morgan lowered his gaze, feeling the truth settle heavily inside him. She kept going, her voice smooth but powerful. I'm not agreeing to return to the way things were. I'm agreeing to build something new, something stronger, something honest. He looked up, eyes shining with uncertainty. I want that too. Michelle nodded once. Wanting isn't enough. Morgan inhaled sharply. This is where your promises stop, she said. You've said enough. Words mean nothing right now. I don't want promises. I want performance, action, consistency, effort. Change. Her voice didn't rise, but it carried enough power to fill the room. Morgan straightened. I'll do whatever it takes. Michelle tilted her head slightly. I'm not asking for whatever it takes. I'm asking for what's required. There's a difference. He took that in slowly. She continued, You can't perform for a week and think trust returns overnight. You can't buy your way back in. You can't charm your way back in. You're going to have to rebuild, moment by moment, decision by decision. Morgan nodded. I'm ready. I hope so, she replied, because I refuse to lower myself again to keep peace. I refuse to dim so you can shine. I refuse to carry the emotional weight of two people. She sat back slightly, letting her words breathe. There's something you must understand, she said. I didn't stay because I'm weak. I stayed because I'm strong enough to give change a chance. Strong enough to rebuild myself while assessing whether you can rebuild with me. Morgan's lips parted, but no words came. Emotion pressed against his throat. Michelle's voice softened, not with fragility, but with truth. This is a turning point, Morgan. If we go forward, it won't be because of comfort or history. It'll be because you met me at a higher place instead of dragging me lower. He nodded again, tears glossing his eyes but not falling. I don't want to lose you. You already came close, she replied. Close enough for me to see the version of life I would have without you. And guess what? That version wasn't weak. It wasn't desperate. It wasn't broken. Morgan exhaled shakily. I'm giving the marriage a chance, she repeated. But you will have to show me who you want to become. He placed his hand on his knee, steadying himself. I accept that. She offered a small nod, one that held more weight than forgiveness, more depth than comfort. It was acceptance of possibility. The room remained quiet for a long moment. Then Michelle stood, smoothing her clothes with calm intention. This is your moment, she said. Treat it with respect. She walked past him, her presence steady, leaving Morgan seated on the sofa with a truth he could no longer avoid. This wasn't a second chance for him. It was an invitation, one he had to earn. The shift between Michelle and Morgan didn't arrive like a dramatic spark. It came quietly, like warmth returning to a room after a long winter. After her announcement, the house didn't feel tense. It didn't feel restored either. It felt open, like the space between them wasn't a battlefield anymore, but a stretch of ground waiting to see what would be built. Later that evening, the temperature outside dropped sharply. Snow tapped softly against the windows, and the wind carried a low hum through the yard. Inside, the living room glowed with the soft light of the fireplace Michelle lit earlier. She didn't light it for romance. She lit it because the night felt cold, and she wanted warmth. Morgan approached the doorway slowly, careful not to disturb whatever peace she'd found. She was seated on the rug near the fire, legs crossed, eyes focused on the flames. The soft orange light wrapped around her, highlighting the steadiness in her posture. Morgan swallowed, unsure whether to join her or give her space. Michelle sensed him before she turned. "You can sit," she said, her voice calm. He nodded and lowered himself onto the opposite side of the rug, leaving space between them, but not too much. The fire popped softly, filling the silence with gentle sound. Michelle wasn't avoiding him. She was simply existing. That alone brought a strange comfort to the room. For several minutes, neither spoke. They just watched the flames flicker, breathing quietly in the shared space. The warmth eased some of the distance, subtle but undeniable. Then Michelle shifted slightly, brushing a stray hair behind her ear. The small gesture drew Morgan's attention more than anything she had said all day. He found himself watching her hands, the curve of her fingers, the softness in her movements. It made him ache, not with guilt, but with a memory of how her touch once centered him. Michelle noticed him looking. She didn't shy away. Instead, she held his gaze for a brief second, long enough to acknowledge the moment but not linger in it. Morgan took a slow breath. "Can the first—" he began, his voice barely above a whisper. She looked at him calmly. "Can you what?" "Can I sit closer?" She studied him for a moment. His voice carried no entitlement, only humility. She nodded once. "Closer is fine." He shifted toward her, carefully closing some of the distance but still respecting the boundary she held. They sat side by side, inches apart, both facing the fire. For a while they didn't touch. Just being near each other felt like a new beginning. Michelle rested her hands on her knees. Morgan's fingers hovered near his own leg, hesitant. He wanted to reach for her, but fear held him back. Not fear of rejection, but fear of overstepping the fragile space she had gifted him. Michelle noticed the hesitation. She glanced down, then up at him. A soft, barely there smile lifted her lips. "If you want to hold my hand," she said quietly, "you can ask—" His heart thudded once, sharp and hopeful. "Michelle," he whispered, "may I hold your hand?" Her gaze softened, but didn't melt. She extended her hand slowly, with intention. "You may." He reached out carefully, gently closing his fingers around hers. The warmth of her skin traveled up his arms, settling somewhere deep within him. It wasn't a passionate grip. It wasn't desperate. It was steady, an offering that carried trust, but also boundaries. Michelle didn't lean on him. She didn't move closer. She simply allowed the connection to exist. The fire crackled softly, casting moving shadows across their joined hands. Morgan studied the shape of her fingers, the firmness of her hold. He hadn't realized how much he missed the feeling of her touch until this moment reminded him. She spoke first. "This isn't forgiveness." "I know," he whispered. "It's connection," she continued. "A small one." "Don't mistake it." "I won't," he promised, voice steady. She nodded, her thumb brushing lightly across his knuckle in a gesture so subtle it could have been accidental. But it wasn't. It was a sign of openness, a signal that the wall between them wasn't impenetrable. The fire warmed the air around them, carrying a quiet intimacy neither had expected to return so soon. Not intimacy of closeness, but of presence. A closeness built slowly, brick by brick. Morgan adjusted his position, leaning back a little, keeping her hand in his. Michelle's breathing slowed, syncing with the rhythm of the flames. For the first time since the betrayal, she allowed her shoulders to relax beside him, just slightly. "Your hand feels different," Morgan said softly. "Stronger." Michelle looked at the fire, not him. "That's because it is." He pressed his lips together, absorbing the truth. Her strength wasn't built for him. It wasn't a weapon. It was the result of her choosing herself first. After a long, quiet stretch, Michelle leaned back on one hand and extended her legs out slightly, getting comfortable. She didn't pull her hand away from his. If anything, her grip settled into something more secure. Not tenderness, not romance, permission. The room felt lighter, warmer than just the fire could account for. This was the beginning of something new. Not a return to what they had, but the early hum of what could be built again. Softness wasn't the same as vulnerability. Presence wasn't the same as surrender. But both were steps forward. And as the fire continued to glow, Michelle and Morgan sat together, not as a healed couple and not as broken strangers, but as two people gently relearning how to share space again. Not rushing, not forcing, just beginning. The warmth of the fireplace lingered even after Michelle released Morgan's hand. Not because of physical closeness, but because something unspoken had finally settled between them. A willingness to try, a willingness to talk, a willingness to let the silence become meaningful instead of heavy. Michelle shifted slightly, pulling her knees up as she leaned against the sofa. She watched the flames dance for a while before she finally spoke. "We should talk," she said softly. Morgan straightened, attentive. "I agree." Michelle took a breath, the kind that steadies the mind before opening a part of the heart that hasn't been touched in a long time. "But before we talk, I need you to understand something." She looked him directly in the eyes. "Honesty is the only language I'm willing to hear now. Not stories, not softened versions, not what you think I want to hear." He nodded. "I'll be honest." She raised an eyebrow. "Not a promise, a standard. Let's start there." Morgan adjusted his posture, folding his hands in his lap. "All right." For a moment, neither said anything. Then Michelle began, her voice calm but layered with depth. "You hurt me," she said plainly, "not just because of what you did, but because of how long I didn't realize you were drifting." She traced her finger lightly across the pattern on the rug. "I felt something changing in you months ago. I didn't know what it was, but I felt it." Morgan lowered his gaze. "I know," she continued, and I asked. "I checked in. I tried to understand, but you kept saying everything was fine. You pushed things aside and expected me not to notice." She paused, then added quietly, "That made me feel invisible." Those words landed softly, but deeply. Morgan's chest tightened. "I never meant for you to feel that way," he said. Michelle nodded slowly. "I know you didn't mean it, but intention doesn't erase impact." Morgan swallowed hard. "You're right." She shifted, facing him fully. "So tell me, what was happening? What was going on in your mind that you didn't share?" This time, Morgan didn't reach for excuses. He didn't try to soften his truth. He met her gaze and answered with the vulnerability she asked for. "I was overwhelmed," he said. "Work kept building. Expectations grew, and I felt like I was failing in every direction. I didn't know how to talk about it without feeling weak. And instead of opening up, I shut down." Michelle listened carefully, reading the sincerity in his voice. "I didn't distance myself because of something you did," he added. "I distanced myself because I didn't know how to be vulnerable." Michelle looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "You do know vulnerability isn't weakness, right?" "I'm learning," he admitted. She leaned back slightly. "Good, because emotional maturity isn't optional in a relationship." He nodded. "I understand that now. And the betrayal?" she asked. "That choice. How did you justify that to yourself?" Morgan inhaled slowly, shame filling his eyes. "I didn't justify it. I avoided thinking about it. It was a moment of distraction. One I should have shut down immediately. I was lost in my own head, and instead of reaching for you, I reached for something that made me feel in control for a second." Michelle studied him closely. "Did she matter?" "No," he said instantly, "not even slightly." She held eye contact for a long, measured moment. He didn't look away. Michelle finally spoke. "I'm asking these questions not to torture you, but because healing requires clarity, and clarity requires truth." Morgan nodded. "I'll answer anything you need." Michelle shifted again, softening a little. "Now I need to tell you something on my side." Morgan waited, attentive. "When you hurt me, I didn't collapse," she said. And that surprised me, because years ago, something like this would have broken me. But instead, it woke me. She glanced at the fire. "It made me realize how strong I actually am. How much I've carried. How much I've allowed myself to ignore. And how much I deserve fullness. Not half presence, not half affection." He swallowed. "You deserve everything." She gave a small, almost amused breath. "We're not there yet." "I know," he said, but I'm willing to work to get there." Michelle's expression softened, not into forgiveness, but into understanding. "For us to rebuild emotionally," she said, "you're going to have to let me into parts of you that you've kept locked for years. The pressure, the fears, the insecurities, all of it." Morgan nodded firmly. "I will, and," she added, her voice gentler, "I have to let down some of my walls too, not all at once, but gradually. Healing doesn't work if only one person is participating." He looked at her with a mixture of admiration and regret. "Thank you for even considering giving me that chance." She looked down, then back up at him. "We're not going backward. We're building something new, something different." Morgan breathed out, relieved but humbled. "I can do that." Michelle offered a small, genuine nod. "We'll see." The fire crackled softly, filling the room with its warm hum. Their breathing settled into a slow, shared rhythm. And in that quiet moment, something flickered between them. Not the old version of love, not the hurt, not the fear, but the early spark of something rebuilt through truth. A new beginning. A fragile one, but real. The early afternoon sky stretched over Anchorage in a quiet wash of pale blue, the kind that hinted at cold but felt softer than usual. Snow rested lightly on the bushes and fence posts, untouched by footsteps, except for a single path leading toward the back garden. Morgan stood at the edge of that path, rubbing his hands together despite the gloves he wore. His breath left his mouth in small, shaky clouds. He had been waiting for Michelle for several minutes, but the cold wasn't what made him restless. It was everything this moment represented. The greenhouse stood silently in the distance, its glass panes reflecting the winter light. The same greenhouse that held the memory he wished he could erase. The place where everything fell apart. The place that changed the rhythm of their marriage. The place that forced him to confront the parts of himself he avoided for far too long. Today he hoped that same place would help them close one chapter and open another. He heard her footsteps before he saw her. Michelle walked through the snow with a steady, unhurried pace. She wore her coat buttoned neatly, her scarf tucked with intention, her posture tall. She didn't look burdened by the memory they were approaching. She looked composed, sure of herself. That alone unsettled Morgan, but in a way that sparked admiration more than fear. She stopped a few feet away from him. "You asked to meet out here?" He nodded, clearing his throat. "Yes, I thought maybe it was time we talked in front of the place where everything shifted." Michelle looked toward the greenhouse, her expression unreadable. "You're right. It is time." They began walking side by side, not touching, not brushing arms. The snow crunched softly beneath their boots. The path felt shorter than Morgan remembered, but every step carried an emotional weight he couldn't ignore. When they reached the greenhouse door, Michelle paused. Her eyes lingered on the frame, the same doorway she had slid into that morning, robe flying, truth landing with devastating precision. Morgan exhaled slowly. "This place holds the worst moment of my life." Michelle turned to him, her expression calm. "It holds one of my worst too, but we're not here to rehearse pain. We're here to reframe it." Her words were gentle, yet they carried depth. Morgan nodded. "I want that more than anything." Michelle placed her hand on the cold metal door handle but didn't push it open yet. "Before we go inside, I want you to tell me something." "Okay," he said, bracing himself. She looked directly into his eyes. "Why did this moment change you?" The question wasn't accusatory. It wasn't angry. It was reflective, an invitation for him to speak from a deeper place. Morgan swallowed, gathering the words carefully. "Because it made me confront who I was becoming, not who I wanted to be." He shifted his weight. I had spent years in control, years building, years pushing myself to the edge. But the moment you walked into this greenhouse, that control shattered, and I realized I had been hiding from myself. Michelle listened intently, her face soft but unreadable. "I didn't just fail you that morning," Morgan continued. "I failed the version of me that you believed in. And seeing your strength, your calm, your clarity, it forced me to reevaluate everything." Michelle inhaled deeply, letting his honesty settle in the air. She touched the door again. Good. Because we aren't here to stare at a memory. We're here to reclaim the space. Morgan blinked. Reclaim it? Yes, she said, pushing the door open. This greenhouse doesn't get to belong to pain forever. The door creaked softly as the warmth inside met the chill outside. They stepped in together, the light filtering through the glass, illuminating the plants Morgan kept here. A habit Michelle always teased him for because he didn't garden. But it wasn't about gardening. It was about peace. Michelle walked slowly to the center of the room. She turned around, letting her hands rest gently on a wooden table. You know what I see when I look around now? She asked. I don't see you hurting me, she said. I see the moment I realized my strength. The moment I decided I wouldn't break. The moment I chose clarity over chaos. Morgan felt emotion tighten in his chest. This place, she continued softly, isn't the place where I lost myself. It's the place where I found myself. The words landed with a quiet power. Michelle looked at him again, calm, centered, steady. You're nervous, she said gently. I can see it. He let out a shaky breath. I am. You should be, she replied. This meeting isn't about closure alone. It's about intention. Morgan straightened slightly. I'm here with all of mine. Michelle nodded. Good, because this is where we decide what this memory becomes, pain or transformation. Morgan looked around, absorbing the truth of her words. The greenhouse no longer felt like a symbol of betrayal. Not with Michelle standing in its center with such unwavering clarity. It felt like a symbol of something else. A chance to rewrite meaning. A place where the old chapter ended. A place where something new could begin. The greenhouse felt different now, not because anything physical had changed, but because Michelle's presence reshaped the atmosphere. She stood calmly, her hand resting on the wooden table, while Morgan watched her with the respect of a man who finally understood that strength didn't always speak loudly. Sometimes it stood quietly in the center of a room and commanded everything without raising its voice. Michelle took a slow breath before she spoke again. You know, she said softly. I had a lot of time to think after that morning. Morgan swallowed, bracing himself. I didn't heal for us, she continued. I healed for me. The words came out gentle, but they struck with precision. Morgan felt them settle deep in his chest, cracking open a place he didn't know he had locked away. Michelle didn't rush. She let the truth sit between them, letting it find its place in the air. When everything happened, she said, I realized something important. I had spent so much time trying to protect the marriage that I forgot to protect myself. I forgot that I mattered just as much, maybe even more. Her tone wasn't bitter. It was rooted in clarity and self-awareness. Morgan stepped closer, not too close, but enough to show he was paying attention. I understand, he said quietly. And you're right, Michelle nodded slightly. When you hurt me, I thought the heartbreak would swallow me whole. But instead, it woke me. It reminded me that my worth didn't sit on your choices. It sits on who I decide to be. She folded her arms loosely, not in defense, but in reflection. I healed because I needed to see myself again, she explained. Not as your wife, not as someone trying to hold us together, but as Michelle, a woman with her own identity, her own strength, her own glow. Morgan opened his mouth, but she lifted a hand. I'm not done. He nodded respectfully. I didn't heal so you could feel comfortable. I didn't heal so you could come back into a neat, restored version of what we were. I healed because losing myself was never an option. Her words were steady, carrying wisdom earned through pain. Morgan felt his throat tighten. I'm grateful you chose yourself, he said softly. And I want to rise to meet who you've become. Michelle's eyes narrowed, not harshly, but with a precision that said she was weighing his sincerity. Do you understand what that actually means? She asked. Morgan took a breath. It means I have to grow, consistently. Not as a performance, not out of fear, not for reassurance, but because I want to be a better man. Michelle tilted her head slightly, assessing him. Growing means facing the parts of yourself you've ignored, she added. The pressure, the pride, the fear of vulnerability, the emotional withdrawal. All of it. I'm ready for that, he said. Being ready isn't enough, she replied gently. Action is the only proof. He lowered his gaze, absorbing her truth fully. You're right. Michelle stepped to the center of the greenhouse, the same spot where she'd caught him standing, too close to someone else weeks earlier. Now she stood there, reclaiming the moment, rewriting its meaning. I want you to hear something clearly, she said, her voice firm but kind. My healing wasn't designed to pull you along with me. I didn't transform so you could feel safe. I transformed, because being small was never my destiny. Morgan met her eyes again, and something shifted in his expression, an awakening, a realization deeper than anything he'd reached before. Michelle continued, I am not returning to who I was. I don't even want to. So if you want to walk beside me, she said softly, you must become someone who's not intimidated by my strength, but inspired by it. Morgan felt emotion press into him like a weight he needed to carry. Not guilt, growth. I want to rise, he said, voice steady. Not just for this marriage, but for myself. I lost direction long before you caught me in here. I lost myself, and watching you rebuild has shown me the work I've avoided. Michelle's gaze softened, not with forgiveness, but with recognition. Good, she said, because a strong marriage isn't built on one person carrying the emotional load. It's built on two whole people choosing each other every day. Morgan nodded, shoulders lowering, his breathing steadier. Thank you for saying that, and thank you for being honest. I'm always going to be honest now, she replied. Even when it's uncomfortable. I want that, he said. She studied him again. You know what today represents, right? A turning point, he said. No, she corrected gently. A reveal. His brow lifted slightly. This, she said, gesturing around the greenhouse, was the place I almost lost myself. But it's also the place I realized my strength. And today, it becomes the place where you realize who you must become. Morgan inhaled sharply, understanding settling like a warm weight across his shoulders. I'm ready, he whispered. Michelle nodded once, slow, thoughtful, deliberate. That, she said softly, is your first real step, and for the first time Morgan felt something shift deep within him. Not fear, not shame, but alignment. The kind that comes when truth is finally accepted, the kind that marks the start of true rebuilding. The air inside the greenhouse felt warmer now, not physically, but emotionally. Michelle's words lingered between them like a gentle echo, reshaping everything that space had meant. The glass walls, once holding the memory of betrayal, now held the quiet possibility of redemption. Morgan stood still, rooted in the truth she had spoken. He watched her with a newfound steadiness. No fear, no desperation, just the awareness of a man humbled and awakened at the same time. Michelle walked slowly toward one of the plant tables, trailing her fingers across a row of leaves. She wasn't avoiding him. She was letting her thoughts settle, letting the moment breathe. Her reflection in the glass looked strong, grounded, and entirely her own. Morgan stepped closer, not closing the distance fully, but enough that she could sense him. Behind her. Michelle, he said quietly. She turned, meeting his eyes with the same calm strength she had carried through every moment of her healing. Yes? He took a slow breath. I want to thank you for letting me stand here with you, for giving me a chance to rise, for being honest even when it was hard to hear. Michelle watched him carefully. There was sincerity in his voice now, deep, steady sincerity, not rehearsed, not polished. Real. I'm learning more from your strength than I ever did from my own, he added. A soft quiet filled the greenhouse. Michelle stepped forward, closing the space between them, not completely, but enough that the warmth of their breath mingled in the air between them. You're beginning to understand, she said. Morgan nodded. I am, and that matters, she added gently. Effort matters. Awareness matters. Becoming better matters. He swallowed, emotion rising again, this time not from guilt, but from the weight of the transformation ahead. "Michelle," he whispered, "will you let me hold you?" The question didn't come from entitlement. It came from humility. Michelle held his gaze for several seconds, reading the layers in his expression. She saw vulnerability. She saw effort. She saw a man who finally understood the depth of what he almost lost. She stepped closer, slowly, deliberately, until she was standing directly in front of him. Her hands rested lightly at her sides, her eyes steady on his. "You may," she said softly. Morgan exhaled, almost in relief. He lifted his hands gently, giving her a chance to pull away if she wanted to. When she didn't, he placed them lightly on her waist, nothing forceful, nothing assuming, just a soft connection that respected the boundaries she had built. Michelle rested her palms against his chest, also gently, feeling the steady rhythm of his breath. "You're different," she murmured. "I'm trying to be," he replied. "Not for me," she said, "but for yourself." He nodded with sincerity. "For myself. And so I can meet you where you stand." Her lips curved into a small, warm expression that wasn't quite a smile, but wasn't distant either. It was the expression of a woman who saw real change. Not words, not wishes, but actual change. Michelle leaned in slightly, not falling into him, not collapsing, but meeting him halfway. Their foreheads touched first, a soft press that felt more intimate than any embrace. Morgan's breath shook lightly. "I'm grateful for you," he whispered. Michelle closed her eyes for a brief moment, absorbing the sincerity. Then she pulled back just a bit, opened her eyes, and looked up at him with a softness he hadn't seen in a long time. "You can kiss me," she said. The permission came quietly, gracefully. Morgan cupped her cheek gently, giving her one final chance to shift away. She didn't. Their lips met in a slow, intentional kiss. Not hungry, not urgent, but full of meaning. A kiss that spoke of healing. A kiss that held gratitude. A kiss that marked the end of a painful chapter and the careful beginning of something new. When they parted, Michelle kept her hand on his chest. "This kiss," she said softly, "is not the end of our problems, but it is the start of our rebuilding." "I understand," he whispered. She nodded. "Good." He took her hand, intertwining their fingers gently. "I'll walk with you, step by step." "And I'll walk as myself," she replied. "Not smaller, not quieter, fully me." Morgan tightened his grip slightly, not to hold her tighter, but to show he accepted that truth fully. Michelle stepped back, taking one long glance around the greenhouse. "This place," she said, "no longer belongs to pain. It belongs to growth. And to clarity," he added. "And to choice," she finished. They exited the greenhouse side by side, not clinging, not rushing, but moving in sync with a quiet rhythm only they understood. The cold air greeted them, but neither shivered. Something warm had settled between them, a restored closeness built on honesty, not illusion. As they walked toward the house, Michelle spoke the final lesson for the viewers of your story, her voice steady and full of wisdom. "Remember, when someone wounds you, your healing is not for them. It's for you. When you rise, rise for yourself. When you love, love from fullness, not emptiness. Growth is a choice. Redemption is a choice. And the strongest people are the ones who rebuild themselves before rebuilding anything else." Morgan glanced at her with admiration, the depth of her strength leaving him speechless. Michelle continued, "And if you're watching this, leave a comment and share the lesson you learned today. Like this video, so it reaches someone else who needs strength. And if you're not subscribed yet, go ahead and join the family. We tell stories that heal, inspire, and remind you of your worth." The screen fades on Michelle and Morgan walking toward the house, two silhouettes moving forward into a future built on truth. Michelle learned that the moment someone hurts you, your first responsibility is not repairing the relationship. It's repairing yourself. She didn't crumble, chase, or retaliate. She rose. And through her rising, she discovered that strength is not loud, and clarity doesn't require shouting. A relationship can only be rebuilt when both people choose growth, not comfort. Michelle didn't allow excuses, promises, or quick apologies to cover the truth. She demanded action, consistency, and emotional maturity. Morgan's redemption only began when he faced the parts of himself he ignored. Forgiveness is not weakness, it's wisdom. Forgiving someone doesn't mean you diminish your worth. It means you rise above the pain, set higher standards, and rebuild only when the foundation is solid. The strongest people are the ones who choose themselves first. Michelle's journey teaches viewers that your identity, confidence, and inner peace should never sit in someone else's hands. When betrayal comes, you don't have to collapse. You can rise, redefine your life, and decide what deserves your heart. Love isn't restored by words. It's restored by consistent transformation. Morgan's change wasn't proven in promises, but in the quiet daily effort to become better.